London, or should I say Londongrad. For the last 30 years, the safety deposit box of choice for Russia's evolving elites, some, but not all of whom, have blood on their hands because of direct involvement in the bombardment of Ukraine's cities, which goes on as we speak and tends to sort of pick up as darkness falls. Why have rich Russians chosen London? How dependent are we on their money, the British establishment, the British government? Is that government now serious about sanctioning them? If so, is it targeting the right people in the right way? And if not, why not? And will it make a difference? Anyway, these are just some of the questions that I scribbled down while thinking about this hour. And I'm sure that everyone here and online will have plenty more. I should say I'm Giles Whittell. I'm an editor here. And we do have, in the person of our guests and their prodigious brains, a great deal of knowledge about this. But you don't have to ask questions. You do have to pitch in, though. We, in fact, encourage you to say what's on your mind rather than ask questions, so that we can all emerge in an hour's time wiser and, selfishly speaking, as a tortoise journalist, with some story leads to pursue. I won't go on because the hour flies by. You can see the yellow bar moving towards the right. There's a little sort of line in the middle when we will pause. It's an innovation, and it allows people to take stock and chat. Only lasts 2 minutes. But the important thing, sort of logistical note at this point, is don't hold back. Everyone is invited to dive in at any point on the chat, which I'll try and keep an eye on with this iPad. If I fail, then my colleague James Wilson, I hope, will draw my attention to you. We'll try and bring in as many people as possible from the ether and also from the room. Raise your hands, your physical hands if you're in the room, your digital hands if you're online and you do want to speak, and we'll try to make a point of getting to you. We are joined then by Bill Browder, author of Red Notice, a brilliant book, which that's not a gratuitous puff, it's a brilliant book, required reading, chief executive of Hermitage Capital Management, builder of a large fortune in Russia in the 90s, was in there before pretty much anybody else from the West. Thank you very much for coming. By Margaret Hodge, MP, former chair of the Public Accounts Committee and legendary scourge of question dodgers. And by Michael O'Kane, senior partner and brilliantly head of business crime at Peters & Peters here in London and a former prosecutor. So, Bill, I want to come to you first. And I want to zero in initially on practical matters which are so urgent. They feel even more urgent now than when we alighted on this question that we've given ourselves: why does London still attract so much dirty money? Boris Johnson, since the invasion on the 24th, has said there is no place for dirty money in the UK. I want to quote, just for context, a parody Twitter account of Boris Johnson's. It's all very, I won't try his accent, it's all very well saying we need to act faster with our sanctions, but you'd be surprised how long it takes to find oligarchs who haven't donated to the Tory party. I mean, apart from the moral case for sanctioning oligarchs with assets in London, what is the practical case for going after them right now? And who is close enough to Putin that it might make a difference? We were talking just before we started, and I was sort of earwigging your conversation about the shortcomings of the proposals and legislation advanced so far. Tell us about them.
Well, so let's first talk about why oligarchs? Why do we care about oligarchs? Why does Putin care about oligarchs? And I think it's important for people to understand that oligarchs are not independently wealthy; they're dependently wealthy. They became wealthy from the goodwill of Vladimir Putin, and their wealth is not all their own. That in most cases they hold significant amounts of money for Vladimir Putin. Why does he not hold money in his own name? Because if he did, and anyone had a piece of paper showing the bank statement or the property register of something that he owned, then they could wave it around and say that Vladimir Putin's not the honest patriot he says he is, he's a crook. And then they could use that to blackmail Putin. And so Putin has to have people he trusts hold assets for him, and the oligarchs, for the most part, hold assets for him. So we then come to this war, and we're looking at this war, and he's indiscriminately shelling buildings and taking over swaths of Ukraine and terrifying and killing all sorts of people. And we're trying to figure out how do we, what can we do? And the ideal thing is to try to make it costly for him personally. And so how do we make it costly for him personally? We go after his money. How do we go after his money? We go after the people who hold his money. Who are the people who hold his money? The oligarchs. Where do they like to hold the money? A lot of them like to hold the money here because this is a great country. We have a rule of law and property rights, which they don't have in Russia. And there's even another reason why they like to have their money here, because they can be almost 100% sure that they'll never be investigated or prosecuted for any type of financial crime. 100%. And I can say that not as some kind of speculative observer, but I can say that as an active person trying to create consequences for Russians involved in money laundering and bringing that money to this country, because my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was murdered in 2009 for uncovering a $230 million Russian government corruption scheme. And we've spent the time trying to find out where that money came. And we discovered that it went all over the world to about 24 different countries. We filed criminal complaints with every different law enforcement agency where the money hid. 16 countries opened investigations. Some countries froze money, some seized money. But the largest amount of money from the entire Magnitsky investigation came to the United Kingdom. And this is one country which absolutely refused to open any type of criminal investigation. And I had an interesting experience, which is I got a rejection letter from the National Crime Agency. And the person who wrote the rejection letter left the National Crime Agency after he wrote the letter and retired. And he invited me to lunch. And he told me that he actually wanted to conduct an investigation, but he was ordered by one of the most senior people in the National Crime Agency under no circumstances to launch the investigation. And so what I can say is that oligarchs like coming here because their money is safe. It's safe from being stolen by other Russians, and it's safe from being investigated by the authorities. And so as a result, the title Londongrad is perfectly fitting. And
the title 11 grand?
What's that? The Londongrad.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was
your title,
bankruptcy.
right?
Yes, no, it is ours.
I'm just trying to help you out here.
Yeah. No, I thought you said Title 11, and I thought we were talking about a new kind of bankruptcy for a moment.
No, that would be interesting if there was. Why don't we do that, Margaret?
Bill,
let's call it Title 11. Thank you.
We want to get on to the toothlessness or otherwise of British white-collar law enforcement in a second, but just for a moment, can we concentrate on the oligarchs who have been targeted since this invasion? The UK government, by this government, right? I mean, everyone's been sanctioning. The UK government initially named three people whose names will be familiar to you, if not to everyone, notionally bag carriers for Putin, Gennady Timchenko and two Rottenbergs, one father, one son. Did they get the right people?
Well, I mean, these are like, really nasty characters that should be sanctioned, but they were already sanctioned by the United States 4 years ago by the U.S. Treasury. The United States ordered some sanctions after the hacking of the U.S. elections, and the U.S. did the right thing. So that the Congress passed a law saying that the government needed to create a list of the 100 wealthiest oligarchs close to Putin. and then they sanctioned 7 of them, and of those 7, so 3 of them were the Rothenberg brothers and Gennady Timchenko, who were all definitely bag carriers, or according to the U.S. government, for the purposes of libel, since we're here, and were bag carriers for Vladimir Putin. So that was good. But so what do you do if you're a Gennady Timchenko or Arkady Rothenberg and you've been sanctioned in the United States and you haven't been sanctioned in the UK or the EU? Well, you probably figure your time is going to come eventually, and so anything you have that are in other countries, you move into the names of family members or trustees or nominees or whatever.
Sorry.
And so by the time we sanction them 4 years later, I mean, that's about as tepid as you can get. That's like saying, look how tough we are, but actually, and here's where the story really gets ugly. There were 7 people on the list. You know who else was on the list? Oleg Deripaska. Why didn't we say, so if we're gonna copy the US list, why are we not sanctioning Oleg Deripaska? Another person on the US list was Suleiman Karimov. He's got all sorts of stuff here. Why are we not sanctioning him? And so it was, when they announced that, I was really disappointed. I thought that was just like almost an insult to anybody who had any sort of, who's a connoisseur of sanctions.
Right. Bill, there are a lot of things that I and I'm sure others would like to ask him. We'll come back to you. But Margaret, let me come to you next. What do you make of Johnson's claim that there is now no place for dirty money in the UK? And then more broadly, what is your assessment of why London was so popular as a destination for Russian money in the first place?
Is, not just was. That's a big question. Let me deal with why London. I think that there are a number of reasons for that. From actually Thatcher's Big Bang, we have regularly deregulated. The Labour government deregulated. Gordon Brown did after that as well. Deregulated to attract finance to London. And that was our first terrible error, the lack of deregulation. The second thing was that...
Wait, the lack of deregulation or the lack of regulation?
The lack of regulation.
Yeah.
The second thing is we've completely, our enforcement agencies, Bill's told the story, where we do have regulation and the enforcement agencies are just incapable of actually even implementing the existing legislation. Partly they're under-resourced, partly we've got a plethora of agencies and everything falls through the middle. And we've all got endless examples. I give them stuff upon stuff upon stuff and it goes into a big black hole and you never hear about it again. The third thing is that we have a very big financial services sector in the UK, particularly in the post-Brexit era where the economy is going to take a hit from Brexit. I think the government is petrified of doing anything that will destabilise the financial services sector. I call them the enablers, so it's the banks, the accountants, the lawyers, I'm afraid, and advisors who not only collude but actually facilitate a lot of the financial crime and money laundering that we get here. And that's another reason why we haven't done enough now, is I think there's still that fear. And there's a total lack of accountability. So if you take, I mean, there's so much of this. If you take just the enablers, so all those people, when they give their advice, I look forward to a little discussion on this one. When they give their advice and support these very creative sort of laundromat structures of a very intricate lot of companies that you move your money from company to company so that people can't see where its origins come from, and you then bring it into the legitimate area to spend. When you do that, none of these people are held to account. None of them are ever held to account. And I think until we change our framework, a legislative framework, and actually make them accountable for what they do, then we will never actually get rid of dirty money. And then the other thing, just to say, particularly under Boris Johnson, that all those ways in our sort of democracy, which we have a democracy with no written constitution, so all those fragile pillars that hold our democracy together, whether it's Parliament, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the press, or whether it's the civil service, they have all been undermined by Boris Johnson. So just think about, even the case about proroguing Parliament. The moment that happened during Brexit, what was the government response? It was to look at judicial review and see if they could limit the extent of judicial review, and it was to look at how judges were appointed, because they didn't want judges to disagree with them. What did they do with the Fourth Estate? The constant attacks on the BBC, the privatisation of Channel 4, and trying to select who they invite to number 10 briefings. What do they do with Parliament? They ignore us. We don't even actually now look at legislation properly. And with an 80, they manipulate, as long as they get the majority, they don't really in any way account to Parliament. And the civil services, anybody dares speak truth to power, they get sacked. So all those things, I think, help limit our ability to hold to account and allow the government to bring in dirty money. It is a bit of an aside, that I agree, but I think it's all part. I think what's happened is we have now become the jurisdiction of choice for dirty money, and that whole culture that has supported that is now infecting the public space and politics.
And we'll hear more about that in a second, but is there not now an argument that everything has changed because of the fact of this war, the brutality of this war, and the government has reacted? There's a laundry list in addition to sanctions, which may or may not be accurately targeted. They have pledged to take another look at unexplained wealth orders, to revamp Companies House so we know who owns companies, add a new register of property owners for what it's worth. Is that worth anything?
Well, this is a moment in history which I think both Bill and I are going to grab with both our arms and to try and see whether we can use this to put in place the proper regulation, the proper accountability, the proper enforcement agencies, and all those things to halt the decline and what's happening there. But just let me take one example. Two. We've got a bill on Monday, which we're going to be discussing, which was first promised to me by David Cameron in 2015. So we're now 7 years on. And this is because so much money is laundered through foreign companies, often associated with that's another reason that Britain is so popular as a corrupt jurisdiction, is our relationship with our tax havens. They're often created in BVIs. You put a company in BVI, you launder your money through there, and the BVI company buys a property here in the UK, and that brings the money into the legitimate system. So obvious we had to have transparency. That's the other thing I should go on about. If you have transparency, you actually just have a chance that you can follow the money and stop it. Promised 2015, coming in next week. I've just had a cursory look at it because the bill was only published yesterday. And it's so badly drafted. It is so appallingly drafted. We can already see the loopholes, which will enable most of the corrupt individuals to bypass it. Companies House drives me completely, utterly potty. We've all been saying that you need a reform of Companies House for years. We set up this, we were proudly said we were one of the first jurisdictions to establish a public register of beneficial ownership. So if you establish a company, you have to put in who is the beneficial owner. The information that goes into Company House is rubbish. There is absolutely no check on it. There's no unique identifier of the individuals who establish a company. You do it for 12 quid. You can put up you can establish a company in 24 hours for 12 quid here. And there are no powers or resources in Companies House either to check the information or actually then to raise red flags where there are obviously people of dubious origin trying to establish companies. Yes. You could easily, for 50 quid, you could quadruple that, make it 50 quid to set up a company. You can still do it quickly, but you could, with that money, you could then resource Companies House to properly check the information, and you can bring in very quickly legislation which would ensure that you have a unique identifier for every beneficial owner and that the powers exist in Companies House. We've been saying that for ages. Let me just finish this bit and then I'll shut up. We've been saying that for ages. They had a consultation which was finished last February, a year ago. And what has he announced? This great step forward. We're going to have a white paper. And that simply kicks it into the long grass and means that yet for another long, long period, we won't have this very simple reform which might help us a lot, again, in pulling out the dirty money. So I don't think they're serious yet.
Which in the circumstances is saying something. Thank you. So, Michael, Bill and Margaret have both said a big part of the answer to the question, which I'll put my glasses on again to remind me, why does London still attract so much dirty money, is there is no effective white-collar law enforcement. You're a former prosecutor. You are now a senior partner at a London law firm representing clients on both sides of this divide. Are they right?
So, Bill says the chances of being prosecuted for a crime of this nature is essentially, or not being prosecuted, is 100%. So I don't agree with Bill. I think it's sort of 99%. So when I look at this situation, what I think is this. I think, obviously, we've got to try and make this event interesting, so I can't agree with everything that's been said, even if I do agree in my heart. The two main financial centres in the world are London and New York. New York is not full of oligarchs. There's a few, but there aren't the same number as there are in London. So why is that? Now, I think it's often very tempting to try and come up with simplistic answers to this. It seems to me, and I act for a number of Russian clients, not oligarchs, Russian clients who historically in our firm has for years been persecuted or pursued by Vladimir Putin because they support political opposition groups, whatever it might be, come to London. There are cooked up criminal cases against them in Russia in the same way there was against Bill and his company. And we represent them in extradition proceedings. We get these excoriating judgments from British judges about how Putin has essentially abused the criminal justice system in Russia. There's no independent judiciary. Time and time and time and time again. In fact, it makes me wonder why the courts entertain any of these extradition requests at all. It's a question we've been asking for years. But coming back to the comparison between London and New York, so they come to London because, these Russians will say to me, we've got rule of law, we've got an independent judiciary, boy, you need to take that seriously and you need to cherish it because it's actually pretty rare. They say what's near the south of France, the schools are wonderful, and it's near Moscow if the time ever comes when we want to go back. But the big difference for me in my world, I'm not a parliamentarian, I'm not a geopolitical expert, I'm only a mere humble criminal lawyer. The big difference for me, if you're in New York and you commit financial crime, the chances of you being prosecuted and convicted are really high, really quite high. And why is that? Because the United States government, it's still not as high as it should be, but the United States government properly resources law enforcement and it properly gives messages that law enforcement is important. They won't put up with corruption or dirty money. There's still a lot of work that they could do. And that their agencies should be properly resourced and are cherished. Here, time and time again, the Serious Fraud Office is told it doesn't have a future. Why would a talented lawyer want to go and work in the Serious Fraud Office? The National Crime Agency brings a case under unexplained wealth orders, loses the case, has to pay a £1.5 million cost order. That's a huge percentage of their budget. If you're working there and that happens to you, you're thinking to yourself, well, I mean, essentially, who was it that said? Who was it that said that laws are cobwebs, they catch the small flies so the hornets and wasps fly through? We have to strengthen the cobwebs, and it's not any particular political party's fault. It's not Boris Johnson. This goes back 25 or 30 years. 25 or 30 years. And when I was prosecuting in the 1990s, the Crown Prosecution Service then we complained, but it was nothing like it is now. It's lost 33% of its budget in the last decade. The Serious Fraud Office brings hardly any cases now. When we represented in the Maxwell case back in the 1990s, the Guardian front page on the 4th of November 1991 said £350 million missing from Maxwell Group Pension Fund. That's what it said, front page of the Guardian. Following morning, City of London Police and the SFO raided Maxwell House. The following morning. That is, it's so unlikely to happen now, it's not even worth mentioning. In fact, the SFO introduced statistics last year. They did no raids last year. I mean, so it's not politically popular to pay lawyers, whether they are prosecutors or whether they are defenders. There are barristers doing criminal defense work out there preparing for cases tomorrow who will be being paid the same for the case they're doing tomorrow as they would have been paid 25 years ago. What other profession in this country is earning the same for the same work they're doing as they would have earned 25 years ago? Repeated governments have essentially tried to limit and reduce the amount of money that's put into law enforcement in this country on both sides, not just prosecutors. You have to have proper defenders too. So is it any wonder that people come here and they think, okay, well, as Bill says, the chances of us getting caught are minimal. And it's true, but nobody wants to do anything about it. And now, can I just say one thing? If anything comes from what we're all talking about tonight, if it means finally, but I don't think it does, because the economic crime bill is still some way off, if it means finally people are going to take this seriously and corruption is actually going to start to be weeded out, not just in relation to oligarchs, but everywhere, then, it'll be a good thing for the British judicial system, which is still the most respected judicial system in the world. But if we keep doing what we're doing, that is not going to last long.
Okay, go ahead, Margaret, and then I want to come to Tim Nolan.
Okay, I mean, I think you have a point, but I think isolating that as the main reason that we're the dirty capital of the world, one of the dirty capitals of the world, is just wrong. It is, the lawyer, we don't pay enough, we don't do proper enforcement. Ironically, even as a Labour politician, I would actually give it to some private companies and give them a percentage. And even if you did it that way, you'd probably get better enforcement than we'll ever get, because you'll never pay in the public sector the same as people can earn in the private sector. But I think you're just ignoring everything else, which is important. So you're ignoring our relationship with our secrecy, our tax havens, which I think really, why is, if you look at the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, they're all the entities that are there are...
I'm not ignoring it. I only had 5 minutes to speak. I'm just talking about the thing that's important to me. I totally agree with you. Obviously, it's not simple. It's complex. But that, for me, is a really critical issue.
It is critical, but it's equally critical to have the transparency, to have the tough regulation, to get at people. The lawyers, don't think the lawyers are the good guys. Time after time, I have seen lawyers sign off, give their QCs, give their signatures to, this is not necessarily economic crime, but a very, very aggressive tax avoidance schemes that are dreamt up, and you get a lawyer's signature on it. And I've named those QCs under parliamentary privilege, but wouldn't dare do so here because they'd sue me. But and then people go off and sell these schemes so that rich people or big corporations then avoid the tax they should pay into the common pot for the common good. So lawyers also are part of the enablers that need to be held to account. So transparency, regulation, and holding the enablers to account is as important as enforcement.
Margaret, thank you. Just before we do our mid-term pausa, I do want to put your point about enablers more generally to you, Michael. You raised the issue of schools here as well. And is it not the case that there's a cottage industry, bigger than a cottage industry, a mansion industry now in this country, consisting of bankers who help Gazprom and others raise money on London capital markets, lawyers who it may not be popular for the public sector to pay lawyers in this country, but it sure as hell is popular for the private sector, to pay lawyers. And then consultants on school fees, on getting your kids into fancy schools. How embedded is Russian money in particular in the UK economy as a result of that industry, which has had close to 30 years to grow now?
Well, obviously it's very embedded, which is one of the reasons why I think the British government is slightly struggling to deal with the sanctions issue. And there are so many complex commercial relationships that now licenses are being granted in order to try to wind those relationships down, because otherwise it's just so difficult. But it's just, again, I come back to the point, if you're there are very, very strict money laundering rules in this country. Okay, they haven't been adequately applied. That's true. But it puts in, if you know or suspect that you're dealing with the proceeds of crime, you've got to make a suspicious activity report, and hundreds of thousands of suspicious activity reports are made every single year. Hardly any are ever acted upon. That's the point I'm making. Why is that? Because the National Crime Agency is fundamentally under-resourced.
Welcome back. Zebedee Albi is saying in the chat, my understanding is that the UK government is terrified in case they get sued by the oligarchs if they can't prove that they are connected to Putin, and that is the cause of the delay. That is why Gove has been tasked with a new law enabling sequestration of funds without punity. I'd be interested to know what people think of that. But in particular, Tim Nolan, I noticed in the chat earlier, you were asking me to ask Bill and Margaret for their view. Well, Tim, if you're there, do you want to put the question yourself?
Thanks, Giles. Yeah, it was just Chris Bryant has got quite a lot of press in the last sort of 48 hours or so regarding his comparison between the EU's speed and breadth of sanction imposition compared to the UK. And he's made a number of suggestions as to why that might be. I must admit, I haven't read up on it sufficiently to be 100% clear myself, but I'd value Margaret and Bill's view as to whether, well, all three panelists actually, do you think those suggestions have merit? And if so, why do you think we're not doing it?
And Frans Timmermans, I should say, this afternoon was trolling the UK Parliament for acting too slowly. Bill.
Just a quick aside on Frans Timmermans. So he was one of my original backers in the Dutch Parliament when we wanted to get a Dutch Magnitsky Act. He then became the foreign minister and wouldn't talk to me for 5 years as we tried to get him to implement the Dutch Magnitsky Act. So in any case, not that he's wrong in this particular thing, but I just saw that. I just thought I'd have to kind of my own private gripe. So the government. So I read this thing saying, it's going to take us months to go after all these guys because we can't prove their connection to Putin. And I read that and I thought I didn't have time this afternoon, but I immediately wanted to get on the phone with some minister to say, well, then why make that the requirement? So we know who the oligarchs are who are connected to Putin. And we have a thing called the Magnitsky Act, which I was responsible, or partially with Margaret and Dominic Raab and various others responsible for getting into place here. And the Magnitsky Act says that you can sanction an individual if they're responsible for human rights abuse or if they're responsible for corruption. Well, in a number of these big oligarch cases, there's evidence they're involved in corruption. So why try to, prove something you don't have to prove? Why not just prove that they're involved in corruption? If you have intelligence that they're connected to Putin, you don't have to prove it. And you have a law that says if they're involved in corruption, and you can prove it, then isn't that the easy way to solve this problem like this minute and just add them to the Magnitsky list?
Okay, so what you're saying is that the laws exist, including the Magnitsky Act, and there is therefore no reason to hesitate. Is there hesitation at the moment?
Well, so somebody was, it was in the paper today, they were saying that it's going to take 3 months or months to sanction these people.
Right.
Because the government is afraid of being sued. They're afraid of being sued because they can't prove there's a connection between the oligarchs' assets and Putin. So why prove that? Why make that a requirement when you can prove much more easily that oligarchs were involved in corruption, and corruption is a trigger for Magnitsky sanctioning them?
And just while we're on this, names make news. Who do we know, we mentioned 3 people earlier on, are proxies for Putin's own money?
Well, I mean, I would love to go, I mean, if I was sitting in a different jurisdiction, I would spend all evening talking about that. But
so what happens if you name them now? What would happen to you?
Then I would be sued, and then I would have to then defend myself.
Okay.
And even if I was correct, I would have to spend, I would then 40% of the costs I would then have to.
Okay, but I want to drill down on this just a little bit. Is it known, near as damn it as a matter of fact, by the US Treasury and the Treasury here, who these people are, and are they those who were on the initial list? Even if it was an old list initially published in 2017, have they got the right people?
So let's just say that the United States is correct, that all 7 people are Putin's wallets. why are we then not, let's just go, using their definition of looking after Putin's money, why are we not having mutual legal assistance between the United States that has the evidence and the United Kingdom where we want to sanction them and they have assets and businesses here? Why wouldn't we do that? I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, somebody should be, a bunch of people should be fired right now for this gross negligence of implementation of, I mean, we're in a war situation. We have a national security crisis, and we have one policy response to this, and they can't even get that right.
There is one public record, public domain example of an oligarch who has come out and given a press conference, Mikhail Friedman, earlier this week, saying it is unfair that I'm on an EU sanctions list. Yes, I'm Russian. Yes, I'm rich, but I'm not I have no influence with Putin. And the clear implication was that he would fight those sanctions in the courts. Is that fair enough?
Well, I mean, so the EU. So we're comparing ourselves to the EU, and the EU has sanctioned a bunch of people after Crimea, including Yanukovych. So Yanukovych was so crooked as hell, a bad guy, corrupt president, and that can be proven. We saw the golden toilets. I mean, so I don't think we have to worry about this. And he went and was able to go to the European Court of Justice and have himself removed from the EU sanctions list. And so, and the EU has had a number of people removed from their sanctions list. And so they either have to change their laws or do better sanctions. And I don't know what's going to happen with this latest group of people. I hope the sanctions hold, but I don't know.
Margaret, did you have a view on whether we are playing catch-up with the EU? And I do want to come to you on this.
Yeah, it's very interesting. When Navalny was imprisoned a year ago? Yeah? Is it about,
Yep.
Anybody know? About a year ago? At that time, everybody was wanted to express their disapproval of that. And he had on his own website, on his own Facebook page, he said, if the West really wants to help me sanction these people, and he had a list there, I think, of the 35 people. And I remember raising that with the Foreign Secretary on that. We had the usual sort of urgent question, and everybody said, isn't it terrible he's been in prison? So I said, well, why don't you do two things and sanction two people on that list, one of whom was Abramovich, the other one was Usmanov. And of course, everything fell on me, but we did nothing then. Right. And now today, out of that list of 35, both the EU and the US have sanctioned 15 more than we have. I mean, I'm not sure how many they have not sanctioned, but we've just failed on that. I've got a list, I've got it here actually, ironically, which I used in the House of Commons, because I use parliamentary privilege, because that means I can't then get sued. And I've passed the list to the Foreign Office of 105. These are business people. These aren't sort of government administrators or elected officials. Government official or elected officials. These are business people who have stolen assets from the Russian people, made themselves rich, are close to the Kremlin, retain their wealth because they remain close to the Kremlin, and we should sanction them. So there are. I don't understand why we don't do it. I work very closely with Chris Browder, and we've been working out these ideas. Well, if you can't, you could use the Magnitsky Act, you could use other legislation. Why don't, under the unexplained wealth orders, it's probably, I haven't seen telly today, but he's probably been saying this, but under the unexplained wealth orders, when you get that, you seize the assets, and then the individual has to explain to you whether or not where their wealth derived from. And if it was legitimate wealth, they get the asset back. Why don't we do that with everybody? Why don't we just say, we'll seize the assets, and then if it is all legitimate, and you aren't an oligarch that has stolen from the Russian people, then we will corruptly stolen from the Russian people, then we will return. We could do that. The other thing we thought of, and again, Chris probably said it on the media today, is we could use parliamentary privilege to sanction. I don't know why we don't do that.
To actually sanction, as opposed to naming people.
Leila
Moran has read out those 35 names.
She read out the 35 names. I read out 10 out of my 105. I thought it was too much to keep people through 105. But I read out 10, all of who had links with the UK. They either had companies on the London Stock Exchange, they had property here, they had children in schools here, they all had links to the UK. We were both complicit and facilitating doing the two things. But we could, I understand, I don't know if this is right, maybe our lawyer friend can help us, but if we use parliamentary privilege, that might be a quicker route to sanctioning. So I'm sure there are ways we can do it. And what I do take the point in is I think the civil service has been so, over the decade of cuts, has lost so many people that there just isn't the capability there, either among lawyers or about anywhere in the Foreign Office or anywhere, to really take the enormity of what we're asking them forward in a sensible way.
Okay, Margaret, thank you. I want to use the remaining time as efficiently as possible. I promised you, and I will. But first I want to come to this gentleman here who has a microphone, and then if possible I want to go to Zebedee Albi, and then we'll come back to you. Hold your thought for a second.
Thank you.
What's your name?
My name's Joe. I've campaigned and worked on anti-corruption and transparency for over 15 years, and I now live in Kensington, which is the #1 borough in the country for anonymous foreign-owned property. And asking this question about why, I think there is one missing piece still we haven't discussed, which is public pressure. And what we're trying to do locally is build a diverse coalition of local businesses, councillors, actually from all parties, residents' associations, local trusts, the sort of diverse group that can complement the national campaigns and the great work that's been done by parliamentarians, I think is essential. And we could franchise that. It could be a Westminster campaign against dirty money, a Camden campaign against dirty money, a Surrey campaign against dirty money. But I think we need some bottom-up pressure and support from the public. And this is the best moment we've had, because this is on the front page, and I can tell you beneficial ownership, even when Cameron announced it in 2013, was not on the front page, and now we have an opportunity to do that. So I think we need to mobilize and do some campaigning.
To do that, don't you need a smoking gun, as it were? Don't you need a really clear way of showing the link between dirty money and what's going on?
Sure, it's called 16 Kensington Palace Gardens.
And that is?
That's the property of Roman Abramovich, which he's trying to sell as soon as possible. Alleged owned property of Roman Abramovich before he's sanctioned, right? And so we have, our borough is unique in the sense that we have literally the icons of dirty money in London, but there are plenty of others that could do that.
Okay, this does come to the really knotty question of whether or not, even if you were to sanction the hell out of all these people, expropriate them all, it would make a jot of difference to policy in the Kremlin right now. And if we had, I'd be really interested to hear your view on that in particular before we close, Bill. But thank you, it's a great point. And yes, we'll come to you, but I did want to come to Zebedee if you're still there, because you make an interesting point about basically Russians not being a monolith.
Sorry, not being a monolith. Oh, you mean about sanctioning? Yeah.
You refer to, it could be honest Russians doing business.
Yes, that's right. Yes, but I think I do take the point that Luke made, afterwards, which is that in a circumstance such as this, some people, even honest Russians, might have to forfeit the ordinary way of doing business. And might have to take the hit if the outcome sought is to prevent what's happening in the Ukraine. So I said that, but I think I've revised it now after what Luke pointed out.
That's a really interesting moral and legal question. Maybe we can come to that. And just before we do, you've been very patient. Yes, you have the microphone. What's your name?
My name is Sigrun Davidsdottir. I'm an Icelandic journalist. About 8 years ago, I interviewed Shirin Ebadi, the Iranian lawyer. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003. And we were talking about corruption in her part of the world and what the West could do. And so she was very firm about that. The best thing that the West can do is to stop taking corrupt money, because that will sort of totally strangle what's going on in her part of the world. And I just wanted to stretch this to Putin. And, well, there's a comment on the question or a thing to ponder on. Would we have Putin and his strength and might if the money connected to him had not been, or it hadn't been possible to invest it in the West?
Great question.
Okay.
Michael.
There's a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to be super quick. First of all, I just want to deal with something that's been said on this side of the room. Bill's work on Magnitsky has been extraordinary. You don't need the Magnitsky Act to do what we're talking about. The law is already there. Since 2014, in the annexation of Crimea, there have been Russian sanctions regulations in place. The Foreign Office did an amazing job when, after Brexit, they transposed about 98% of all EU regulations into UK domestic law in time. Now, when the MH17 Malaysian aircraft was shot down in the summer of 2014, those sanctions were tightened. Sectoral sanctions were imposed against oil and gas exploration and on banks and the ability to raise debt over more than 90 days. So those rules are already there. What happened on the 10th of February this year is that regulation was expanded to cover anybody who is what's described as an involved person, i.e. somebody who benefits from Russia. And then there's a list of industries: chemical, construction, transport, energy, finance. Anybody connected with any of those industries can be sanctioned. All you need are reasonable grounds to suspect they're involved in those industries. That's it. You don't need to show corruption. You don't need to show a connection with Putin. So please, can we just get that right? Now, the evidential threshold is relatively low. Why has the Foreign Office not done it? Really good question. Particularly when we've known the CIA called the invasion of Ukraine at the end of November. Why haven't we all been lined up? The politicians were saying, we've got this draconian series of measures. We've all joined up, the EU, the US, and the UK is ready to go to try to put Putin off invading. Well, obviously that wasn't true. So there's a disconnect between what the politicians are saying and what's actually practically happening on the ground. Why is that? Why is that? And that's a really interesting question. We should never allow that to happen again. But it reminds me of the evacuation from Afghanistan. There was a whistleblower in the Foreign Office, Raphael Marshall, who talked about what was happening. It was chaos, a lack of boldness, risk aversion, people working from home, people on holiday. I think there's some very, very good, diligent people working in the Foreign Office, I suspect under huge pressure, with politicians having said stuff they couldn't back up, they didn't realize was untrue, putting huge amounts of pressure on them to get stuff done and meet the evidential threshold, because there will be lawyers who will be challenging it. So I have a huge amount of sympathy for good, dedicated, diligent civil servants trying to do their best in difficult circumstances. One answer, controversial, outsource it. Outsource it. I'm happy to sign the Official Secrets Act. Outsource it. There are lots of sanctions practitioners in London, lots of us who've been doing this work for a decade or more. Very happy to help.
Okay, so let me be clear about this. I heard you right that you said that given that the legislative framework is in place, it fell, even before the war, to the FCDO to enforce. Is that right? Is that what you said?
No, what I'm saying is, with the Afghanistan evacuation, we found out what was really going on because there was a whistleblower. Otherwise, no one would have known. And I'm suggesting that potentially the same stuff is going on now. There's a disconnect between what the politicians are saying, what's actually happening on the ground. So we've got to hold people to account and say, well, you said everybody was lined up. That wasn't true. On what possible basis did you say that? It's quite clear that this work had not been done. You shouldn't be saying this stuff unless the work's done.
So what UK government agency does it fall to, absent outsourcing, to enforce these sanctions?
Well, putting the sanctions together is the work of the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. Enforcing sanctions is OFSI in the Treasury, with the help of the National Crime Agency if people breach sanctions. That's another issue, because OFSI is unbelievably under-resourced. In the bad old times, in the quiet times, getting a license from OFSI to engage in a bit of legal work took between 4 and 9 months to do a simple piece of legal work. They are inundated now. There's a tsunami of license applications coming, and there's only a few of them doing them. So I would double that time, which is why these general licenses are being issued, because they can't cope. So think, oh God, well, just get on with it and you can do what you want. So it's a sort of, I'm painting a depressing picture, but there are some solutions if people would just be prepared to be a bit bold, a bit imaginative, and just seize the moment.
Thank you. As forecast, time has flown by. So were you raising your own hand or drawing my attention to Who was it? Max, go ahead. Be brief if you don't mind.
I was going to be very brief, maybe perhaps a question for people to think about. I was just wondering whether we have all these solutions. Do we not do, or we have all these suggestions, do we not do it due to incompetence, or do we not do it deliberately? In terms
Great question. Okay. The flag is up, but I want to give both of you a final word. We published, uploaded a podcast this week called Lord of Siberia about Yevgeny Lebedev's elevation, largely through the deployment of money, to the House of Lords. We're a newsroom. I would love to know from both of you who or what you think we should go after next as a story to illuminate this very troubling disconnect between will of the people, laws on the books on the one hand, and dirty money getting away with it despite everything on the other. Bill.
I hate to suggest another Lord, but
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that the story of Lord Gregory Barker.
It's a good one, and Paul's done him as well. Yes.
No, but I think more needs to be done on this thing. I mean, why is it that a man who's a member of the House of Lords, working for a Russian oligarch, while he's a member of the House of Lords, goes to Washington to lobby U.S. Congress to take him off the sanctions list, and then gets paid $5 million afterwards? How is that not a sackable offense? And how is it that the House of Lords can even function with that type of precedent in it? I mean, it's just, I mean, it's, and I just can't get my head around that. And you know, we talk about, I mean, we talk about dirty Russian money influencing British policy, and it's like, I mean, there's a prima facie case, and he's still in the House of Lords. I mean, how can he not be kicked out? And I mentioned this to people who say, oh, it's complicated, you know, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I just can't get my head around that. That's, anyways. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you.
What do you want me to say? I mean, I can't just say I agreed with everything there. So I think it is the resourcing, and it's crazy. And I would outsource it. I mean, you know, and I'm saying this as a, you know, somebody of the left. I would outsource this because we want to get it done. We want to get it done. What would I go after now? I mean, there's so bloody much. I think actually one of the things you talked about, you know, Greg, but I think, you know, and I'm not saying this for partisan reason. I don't mind if you go after the Chinese and Labour, but I just think that Russian money in the Conservative Party is, you know, it really needs to be
As a
exposed.
parliamentarian, can you help us get sight of the full Russia report?
Why aren't you not?
No, we only got a pathetic redacted version, and somewhere.
All right. Well, I've only got a redacted version. Yeah.
I mean, it's our money paying those guys anyway.
Yeah.
No, it's a good point.
But I think reminder. You know, you've sent me. I've got my 100 here. Do you want this?
Yeah, we'll take that. Thank you so much.
You can take your pick on that lot.
Look, as I say, time is up, and I'm very conscious that people have been very busy in the chat. I'm sorry that I hope it has been worthwhile engaging in the chat as well as in the room. There are just a couple of points that I'd like to sort of remind myself and us of at the end, which is one of them, which is that Bill and Michael agreed within 1% on the key fact in all this, which is holders of large and in many cases ill-gotten fortunes have brought them here saying they come for the rule of law, knowing damn well that the rule of law will not be applied when they get here. Margaret gave us a really useful potted history of how this all began with deregulation under Thatcher, you're saying, but also under Blair. The sort of attrition of enforcement agencies' capacities, and a government now that's petrified of damage to the financial sector. I think the question of a culture of enablers is fascinating. It's also, though I hesitate to say it journalistically, very sexy, but also very hard to get at. And we should keep trying. I suppose the question I should have asked you, Margaret, is do you think we can ever distinguish between the dirty money that is clearly helping to enable what's going on in Ukraine, and money that happens to be Russian but is not dirty, but is nonetheless part of a system that is so deeply embedded in our culture. I think that's a tough one. I mean, the culture of enablers, and this will be your very last word, and I'm sorry to go on beyond the end of the hour, that you raised right at the beginning. Is that something that we can ever rid ourselves of, and should we? I mean, it could quickly turn into a sort of latter-day McCarthyism.
No, not at all. You just make people accountable for what they do. And I think we were talking in the 2 minutes we had about what legal thing we would have to bring in to ensure. All you're saying is if you give advice, if you support, if you enable or you collude with money laundering and bringing dirty money into the UK, you have to be held for account for it. And I think it'd be quite easy. I'm not a lawyer. We've only got one lawyer in the room. But it would be quite easy to devise something. We think we're looking at doing this if they bring forward the economic crime bill. What we're having on Monday is not an economic crime bill, although they've called it that. What I hope we will have in the next session is an economic crime bill, which will, and one of the things we have to look at that is how we ensure that enablers are held to account. That's all we want. So if you act properly, fine. If you don't, like any other criminal, you're held to account.
Bill, Margaret, Michael, Joe, for public pressure, thank you all very much for joining us here in the room and online. I feel this is an enormously complicated subject that will warrant many thinkings down the line and a lot of work, and we will attempt to do that work. In the meantime, stay tuned. We'll be doing more of these thinkings next week, and as long as the grim news warrants it. But thanks again very much for joining us.